Greetings. Welcome back to another Truth Factor discussion. I hope that everyone is having a good day and you're ready to jump into our study of John. We're picking up in John chapter 18, roughly right around verse 28 is where we'll pick up officially in our discussion of where we left off. However, there's a few things we want to kind of review real quickly, and then we will get to that point. Listen, I want to thank you so much for taking time out of your schedule to join us for our study today. If you have any thoughts or comments, we'd love to hear from you. You can let us know what you have to think there in the comment section connected with the Facebook video, or on the YouTube side of the world, the chat area connected there. Let us know what you have to say. If maybe this is the first time you've joined us, then tell us who you are. Bob from Minnesota, New England, wherever. We'd love to kind of know where you're from and just know and are thankful for the fact that you are with us. You can also send us email to questions@truthfactorlive.com, questions@truthfactorlive.com, or email us individually, as you'll see on the screen there. I still have to add Caleb. You can email him at caleb@truthfactor.com, just like you can do everyone else. All right, so let's go ahead and jump right into this today. Before we get to where we are supposed to be picking up at, just kind of as a brief reminder here, in verse 24 of the text, and I'll go ahead and bring this up here for just a moment there. We have Jesus having answered here in this section here, the high priest then asked Jesus about his disciples and his doctrines and so forth. And he is there with Annas at this current point in time. After this exchange, Annas sends him bound to Caiaphas, the high priest. And then following that particular section, we looked at Peter's denial of Jesus there in verses 25 through 27. Now, I mentioned a while ago that we're going to pick up with verse 28. However, Luke records something that John does not, as far as a stop in between point A and point B of this particular night there. And Caleb, you kind of suggested this last week. What are you referencing there?
Looking at Luke 22, so if you go to Luke 22, 66 through 71, you have the address before the Sanhedrin.
Go ahead and read that if you want to.
I think So looking at verse 66 there, it says, when it was day, the council of the elders of the people assembled both chief priests and the scribes, and they led him away to their council chamber, saying, if you are the Christ, tell us. But he said to them, if I tell you, you will not believe. And if I ask a question, you will not answer. But from now on, the Son of Man will be seated at the right hand of the power of God. And they all said, are you the Son of God then? And he said to them, yes, I am. Then they said, what further need do we have to testimony? For we have heard it ourselves from his own mouth. So you see there, he confirms it for them. He gives them the ammo they need to proclaim him as king. That's the charge they're going to take to Pilate, as we're going to see in John. So you see a transition here from the blasphemy charge or the religious charge against him to, we're going to make this a political charge before the Romans. And of course, I think Brian pointed out last time, he really saves their case. He admits what they need so that they can push forward with the trial, which just goes to show you that Jesus is willing to sacrifice himself, and that was God's plan, and they need his help to do it.
Okay, I remember that. That was interesting. That without his own actions, they would have nothing. They would have no case. He kind of built it for them. Yeah. All right. Any thoughts from Tom or Brian on this?
I think it's fair to point out. We go to Luke. John's writing all this, assuming that we've read Matthew, Mark, and Luke. So we got to go back sometimes and look at what we should already know as we look at John. And we skip the other trial, which is fine, with Caiaphas, because they just try to go to the official trial there in the Sanhedrin. But of course, John skips all that because we should already know that. And we're going to go look at him before Pilate now.
Okay. All right. Makes sense. Makes sense. Any thoughts?
Yeah, I'm curious. We don't have, and I know this is slipping back, but the verse 24, we don't have any other details about when he was before Caiaphas, do we? Or is that in Matthew? In other words, trial number 2.
Yeah, we have Matthew 26, 57 through 68, and Mark 14, 53 through 65.
Got it. Okay.
Luke
But
just
not here in John. John doesn't even mention it. John doesn't mention Caiaphas, Sanhedrin, or Herod. So
well, he mentions Caiaphas in verse 24, but he doesn't.
Well, I mean, but he doesn't mention the trait. Doesn't really.
He goes. I mean, and it's like Caleb said, all these.
Yeah, the assumption is we're reading all four.
Recorded.
Yeah.
These details are already recorded. So.
Yeah.
Okay.
Got it.
All right. Any other thoughts? All right. Let's go ahead and now jump forward back to John chapter 18, verse 28. And now let's continue with John's account of this. And Brian, if you would, pick up with verse 28. Let's see. Let's read down through verse 38. It's kind of a little lengthy of a read here. But let's look at this section, if you would.
Okay. Reading today from the New King James Version, John chapter 18, verses 28 through 38. Then they led Jesus from Caiaphas to the praetorium, and it was early morning. But they themselves did not go into the praetorium, lest they be defiled, but that they might eat the Passover. Pilate then went out to them and said, "What accusation do you bring against this man?" They answered and said to him, "If he was not an evildoer, we would not have delivered him up to you." Then Pilate said to them, "You take him and judge him according to your law." And the Jews said to him, "It is not lawful for us to put anyone to death," that the saying of Jesus might be fulfilled, which he spoke, signifying by what death he would die. Then Pilate entered the praetorium again, called Jesus, and said to him, "Are you the king of the Jews?" Jesus answered him, "Are you speaking for yourself about this, or did others tell you this concerning me?" Pilate answered, "Am I a Jew? Your own nation and the chief priests delivered you to me. What have you done?" Jesus answered, "My kingdom is not of this world. If my kingdom were of this world, my servants would fight so that I should not be delivered to the Jews. But now my kingdom is not from here." Pilate therefore said to him, "Are you a king then?" Jesus answered, "You say rightly that I am a king. For this cause I was born, and for this cause I have come into the world, that I should bear witness to the truth. Everyone who is of truth hears my voice." Pilate said to him, "What is truth?" When he said this, he went out again to the Jews and said to them, "I find no fault in him at all."
All righty. Thank you, Mr. Brian. So we find ourselves now at a different point in time with this. They've led Jesus, of course, from Caiaphas to the praetorium in his early morning. Brian, what is the praetorium effectively?
Well, it's a good question. I know it's the seat of authority for Pilate, but I don't know that I can bring much more. We might use a comparison to the courtroom, the law office. It's like I said, it's the seat of authority, of the ruler of the people. And there can be a praetorium for even the Roman Caesar had a praetorium. So I know that, but I don't know how to describe it beyond that. I don't know what I would say beyond that. I think maybe these other guys have.
Well, was it gold
smarts.
line made out of stones? No, I'm only.
Yeah. I can make.
It is what
out.
you. I think it is what you said. It's basically the courtroom. The word praetorium kind of carries that idea. I guess, but my point of the question was, and it was too broad. This is now under the Roman governing. They're no longer with the Sanhedrin. They're no longer within a place that would be clean, okay, if you would. This is now within the Roman scope of authority and the Roman, go ahead and call it courtroom. It's probably a little more complicated than that, but effectively that. And you mentioned that earlier there. The reason why I made the point is because he says, "But they themselves did not go into the praetorium, lest they should be defiled." all right, because they were needing to eat the Passover later. And so we have them fully before Pilate at this point.
Hey,
Yeah.
John, according to the Lexham Bible Dictionary, and Lexham is associated with Logos, it says it describes the praetorium as the official residence of a Roman governor.
Okay, yeah, that would fit the.
And so you've got that. So you've got where he resides. And of course, this wasn't the only place that Pilate resided, but I guess when Pilate was in Jerusalem, this is where he was. And obviously there was a place to try people and so on. I guess I think of the White House. The White House has the Oval Office. I mean, the president does a lot of his work on the premise of his quote unquote home. And so you probably have the same thing with Pilate.
Yeah. Jimmy shares the following. Praetorium, in ancient Rome, a praetorium referred to several things, primarily the tent or building of a general in a military camp, but also the official residence of a Roman governor or a splendid country house. In the Gospels, it specifically refers to the temporary palace or headquarters of the Roman governor while in Jerusalem, which was actually Herod's palace. And so taking him to the official area of those who were going to be trying him. That's according to Google. So he reached out to Google for that. There's nothing wrong with that
Google
at
knew
all.
more than I did. So
Yeah. Well, sorry about throwing you a question off the.
no,
wall
it's
like that.
okay. I like I said, I should have had an answer for that. I will say the thing that I find is fascinating, that they won't go in the praetorium. Oh, we don't want to be defiled, but they'll kill somebody. They'll illegally arrest somebody. They'll beat him. They'll do all these different things, but we don't want to step into the praetorium. We don't want to get our hands dirty, But
Hey,
like I
Brian,
said, it's just crazy.
Take that further, Brian. They're willing to lie.
Yeah,
They're immoral. I mean, they're willing to be corrupt and deceitful and greedy, and every other term associated with their moral character. They're willing to break all of that.
Yeah.
But we can't defile ourselves when we touch that sheep or whatever.
Well, I don't want to go too far off base, but this is what Jesus talked about in Matthew 23 by calling them whitewashed sepulcher. You had rotten bones on the inside, but they look good outwardly. Well, in this case in point, their inside was corrupt. They were going for the outward appearance of things. Yeah. All right, good points. Good points. Their response is funny, and we've encountered people like that in our day and time. Why did you bring him here? Well, clearly he's guilty. If not, we wouldn't have brought him here. I mean, it's, and that's the reasoning they used there in verse 30. And so Pilate said to the ones who brought Jesus, "You take him and judge him according to your law." And this touches now on what you guys were talking about before our study. Their reply was, "It is not lawful for us to put anyone to death." All right. Was that completely accurate?
It occurs to me it might be the case. I've always said, they had no problem putting Stephen to death, so I don't think it's a general lawful thing. But it occurs to me, I wonder if it's possible that then in the context that this is the Passover, that they can't do it on the Passover, might be some of the reference there too. I've always just assumed that it's a bluff. They do whatever they want. And here's what's more important: Pilate gives them full permission as this conversation goes on. He says, "Okay, he's yours. You do it." He gives them the authority to put Jesus to death, and they still won't do it. So like I said, perhaps some of this is the lawfulness of the Passover. They can't do it too, but like I said, they'll as this conversation goes on, they're going to make a pretty direct. They're going to get pretty direct permission from Pilate to, "You have my permission. Go kill him."
Yeah. I think it's a valid point. It would probably pertain to the fact it was the Passover. Yeah. But verse 32, that the saying of Jesus might be fulfilled, which he spoke, signifying by what death he would die. So he's not going to be stoned to death. You think about it, that's what happened to Stephen. And they attempted that with Paul. But Jesus' death, he would be lifted up, I believe was the language he used on a couple occasions, at least one, I would think, in the Gospel of John. And we often say when he talks about that, John said, he said this signifying about what death he would die, indicating there, or at least it sounds like he's indicating crucifixion. And the Jews, if I understand right, did not crucify. It was the Roman government that would do that. Any thoughts?
Well, we were talking about this a little bit last time.
Okay.
In Matthew 26, 3 through 5, the high priests gathered together and they called Caiaphas and plotted to take Jesus by trickery and kill him. But they said not during the feast, lest there be an uproar among the people. So they don't want to kill him during the Passover. Yet they take him to Pilate, and eventually they all cry for crucifixion. So it's interesting there that they don't want to kill him. To Brian's point, I think, they could do whatever they wanted, and they probably had permission, but they also don't want to kill him. Do they think Pilate's going to hold him for a while? And what's their thought process there, you think?
Uh,
Oh, no, that's a good question.
And Caleb, I think you brought out a good point with that verse. We read before that they didn't want to, they wanted to put him to death, but they wanted to wait till after the feast. So it very well could be that the concept of this, it is not lawful for us to put him to death. They're appealing to their interpretation of the law of Moses. From that standpoint, we can't do it right now, and we're not willing to wait anymore. Because think about this: how often had Jesus appeared in Jerusalem during feasts? Then after the feast, he's gone. He's going to slip away again. That might have been a little bit of their reasoning, and of course the uncleanness. Stoning somebody to death probably would have had some issues with being quote unquote clean, during a feast and those types of things. Just kind of my thinking.
All right. Brian, I think Matthew, I was thinking a text in John, but doesn't Matthew tell us a little more specifically that Jesus knew how he was going to die?
Yeah, you're right that John does say in John 3 that he would be lifted up, and so in a generic way he predicted it. But he was very specific to his disciples months before this. He had started back in, I think, Matthew 16 was the first time he said, I'm going to be put to death, and it's going to be the Jews that start it. It's going to be the Gentiles that finish it. But then in Matthew 20, verse 19, he is like completely specific. He says, I'll be delivered from the Jews will arrest me. They'll be betrayed. It'll be the priests and the scribes, and they'll condemn me to death. But it'll actually be the Gentiles who kill me. And not only are they going to kill me, they're going to crucify me. But then 3 days later, I'll come back to life. And what I've always been struck about this statement in Matthew 20 is that it had to be unbelievable. The way what Jesus is describing is a series of events that are each one impossible. That the Jews are going to condemn him to death. Why? Why could they condemn him to death? He doesn't do anything bad. He saves people. He brings people back to life. He heals people. What does he do that's bad? Then when the Jews condemn him, he says, and the Gentiles are going to crucify me. That's absurd. The Gentiles, they only crucify horrible criminals. They don't crucify Jewish, law issues. That's not going to happen. And then of course I'm going to rise on the third day. Well, that's just physically impossible. So when Jesus would say things like this, I think the apostles just kind of looked at each other and say, maybe he's speaking figuratively, or, that, and it's so clear they don't get it. On the third day, they're not at the tomb saying he said he's coming back. In fact, the only people, this is one of the things I've always thought is remarkable, the only people that are worried about him coming back on the third day are his enemies. They're the only ones that seem to remember that, and they're the ones saying, hey, we need to put a guard on the door because he said he'd come back. His apostles aren't at the tomb saying, hey, he said he's coming back. So it's clear that when Jesus says this, and then how many times do we have conversations like that where you say something very plainly and clearly, and it's clear, it goes right. If you don't have hair to catch it, a lot of things go over my head. So, it's clear that what he's saying is just going right past them, and they're not grabbing it at all. They're just missing the whole point. So he was very specific about how this is going to happen. People should have been saying, wow, he said exactly how this is going to happen, but they're just kind of dumbfounded. They're just all caught up and so shocked that they can't put this together.
Okay. That's a good explanation. Yeah, good point. I appreciate you bringing that up there. All right, let's see. Let's come down to a little bit to now verse 33. All right, so kind of touching here on the charge. Okay. The Pilate entered the praetorium again, called Jesus, said to him, "Are you the king of the Jews?" And of course, his response was very direct, because this was part of the charge that was brought against him there. Jesus answered him, "Are you speaking for yourself about this, or did others tell you this concerning me?" I think you already touched on this a while ago, guys, but just kind of as a quick reminder here, let me bring up the right button there. For him to say that he was the Messiah was not going to get him in trouble with the Roman government. But if they could bring a charge against him that he was going to be king, then that would be a clear, I'm not sure the word I'm thinking about, but revolution, to overthrow the Roman government. And so does that kind of explain why Pilate asks this question, "Are you the king of the Jews?"
Yeah, I think that ties in. I mean, he's fishing. I mean, he's fishing for reasons. I mean, he's looking for an answer. I mean, I think I've mentioned this before. If I counted correctly, when you put the 4 Gospels together, there are 7 times associated with Pilate, where in one way or another he declares Jesus innocent. I mean, over and over, it recorded in the Gospel. So I mean, here, he's fishing. Are you a king? I mean, do I need to be worried about you? And Jesus, Jesus puts him on this. When I say puts him on the spot here, he says, "Are you saying this because you're genuinely inquiring, or was it something said about me?" And incidentally, in that statement, Jesus is still in control, because I mean, he could have said something that would have given Pilate reason to condemn him and have him crucified right then. So I mean, he answers in such a way that doesn't happen. As a matter of fact, verse 38, I find no fault in him. So when we get down to that, you've got that idea. So
okay, all right.
Is Pilate just echoing the charge there when he asks him, like, "Well, this is the charge. And this is what they're claiming. Is this who you say you are?" And of course, he tells them that his kingdom's not of this world. So that kind of frees Pilate to say, well, he's not guilty then, because he's not trying to rise up some other power besides Rome. He's claiming a spiritual kingdom. So,
he's not trying to rebel against Rome. He's just a nut. And I'm talking about, in Pilate's mind, just somebody that's deluded. I mean, but not worthy of death.
Yeah, that's a good point. Yeah, that's a good point. Any other thoughts or comments about that? Okay. All right, let's see. Come back here for just a second. There we go. So then in verse 35, verse 34, Jesus' reply was, "Are you speaking for yourself about this, or did others tell you this concerning me?" And so Pilate responds, "Am I a Jew?" He says, "Your own nation." Oh, I'm sorry. Boy, I'm hitting the wrong buttons today. He says, "Am I a Jew? Your own nation and the chief priests have delivered you to me. What have you done?" Now, this is a very powerful statement, guys, in verse 36, when he explains, "My kingdom is not of this world." And his reasoning is very simple. If it were, then my servants would rise up and fight, and I should not be delivered to the Jews. But now my kingdom is not from here. Let's talk about this passage here for a few minutes. Tom, when you look at this, since you're up on the screen there in verse 36 there, does this, we've already dealt with the fact that his disciples were still struggling with the concept of understanding his kingdom. Okay. They still were kind of thinking that he would, some of the questions they asked, they were still thinking that he would sit on the throne and maybe they would be able to be on each side of him. But the flaw with that reasoning is seen within the text here. He makes the point that if his kingdom were of this world, what would his followers be doing at this very moment.
Yeah, I mean, and that's the point he's making. He said, if Rome was concerned about my kingdom, physically, I have a following, and they're loyal to me. They would fight. By the way, I just kind of thought about this. I wonder if Pilate was told about what happened in the garden. As in when Peter cuts off the ear of Malchus, and Jesus heals the ear. I wonder if Pilate was told any of that stuff. So here he is. He's making this point. My kingdom is not of this world. And if it were the war, you would know it. You would know it. And incidentally, don't forget in this, something else comes to my mind, always wandering. There was a group of the Jews known as the Zealots who were a concern as far as the Roman Empire was concerned. And so Jesus dispels that in this particular statement. He said, I have no intention to physically overthrow Rome. That's not my intent, or even to overthrow you or anything like that. Now, the other point that has to be driven home here is Jesus says, my kingdom is not of this world. Yeah. Let's get that registered, because premillennialism wants to say that the kingdom is of this world. And they're expecting Jesus to come back and establish his physical kingdom. This is the primary text that leads to a discussion of other texts that point to the fact that Jesus never intended to establish a physical kingdom. That was not his purpose. From the very beginning of trying to teach his disciples, he wanted them to get that point. Just go to the Sermon on the Mount, Matthew 5-7, where Jesus describes the kingdom. And then, of course, you have Luke 17:21, the kingdom of God is within you. And again, in Romans chapter 14, where he talks about how the kingdom of God is not eating and drinking. And so you have all of these verses that indicate that the kingdom was intended to be spiritual all along. And Jesus emphasizes that to Pilate. I'm no threat to your reign right now.
All right. That's a good point. Good thoughts. So this kind of touches on the question that we were talking about, kind of a pre-show discussion before we actually went live with it. But in verse 37, Pilate asks him directly, he says, are you a king then? And Jesus says, you say rightly that I'm a king. For this cause I was born, and for this cause I have come into the world, that I should bear witness to the truth. Everyone who's of the truth hears my voice. How do we factor that verse in? Because he says in the text, you say rightly that I am a king. But yet, and I'll throw this at Brian, I guess, we recognize, or at least we understand, that his reign as king really didn't take place until he ascended to the right hand of his Father, at least the way that we kind of parse it from the scriptures. Do you have any thoughts on that?
Yeah, it's a great question. So the original question was verse 33, are you king of the Jews? Now, I will say Jesus was born king of the Jews. He was the heir to the throne of David. This is Matthew's big. We say each gospel kind of has a particular push, and Matthew is all about the kingship of Jesus. And Matthew's point is Jesus was born the heir to the throne of David through Joseph, who is not his biological father, but is his father for intended purpose. So he has that heirship of the throne of David. So in other words, and this is kind of interesting because we have some testimony in history as well about this outside of the Bible. But if you said, hey, we want to find the guy that's supposed to be the heir to the throne of David, let's start looking around. Jesus of Nazareth is the man that you're going to look for. You're going to go find him because he's the son of the son of the son, the king of the king of the king, up to the last kings of Judah through his father Joseph. I think Tom makes a point to say he's also descended from David through Mary, but the kingship comes through Joseph, and so he is king of the Jews from birth. That's why in Matthew 2, the very first thing they want to kill him for when he's just a boy is for being born King of the Jews. And in Matthew 27, when they hang him on the cross, the title above it is King of the Jews. So he is King of the Jews. Now, I know Caleb had some really good comments about this too to make before the show. The idea that Jesus wasn't the King of Kings yet. He isn't the one. He hasn't received, and this is the Matthew 28:18. He hasn't received all authority yet. He doesn't receive that till he arises from the grave. And that's the prophecy, like Isaiah 53, that he wouldn't be glorified until he had been crushed. That then he becomes the King of Kings. Then his authority is over the whole world. And this is when the prophets in the Old Testament talked about a kingdom that would take over the whole world, that would conquer the whole world. Jesus then conquers the whole world because his authority is then over all of the entire earth. That's why anybody in the world can become, from then till now, anybody in the world can become a Christian. They couldn't become a Christian, before that, because Jesus' authority wasn't over the whole earth. He was just born the King of the Jews. And so I would say that that's the answer to this question. He's a king as far as being King of the Jews means. And that doesn't mean much, by the way, because the kingdom of the Jews, God had cursed it and had taken away that kingdom and said, never again in Jerusalem will a king sit. And that's something we point out to our premillennial friends a lot, that Jesus can't reign from the city of Jerusalem, because that was God had divinely said that it'd never happen again. Back in, what is it, guys? Jeremiah? I just forgot the verse. Okay, Tom says it's Jeremiah. So the point is this, like I said, he's King of the Jews, but it doesn't mean a lot, because it just means he's the heir of David that was prophesied back in like 2 Samuel 13 and other places that would come forward from that. So I've said a lot there. I'll let the other guys say something.
All right. It's good points.
Yeah,
Caleb,
one of the points.
or Tom.
I was going to say, oh, sorry. Caleb, you got something to
Go ahead.
say? Go ahead.
Well, it's an important point to make that his kingdom's not of this world, because he's reigning today. And like Brian mentioned, our premillennial friends, they want to say he's got to come back and reign. Well, he's already reigning. He's reigning on the throne of God, because that's where he's ascended to after he's crushed. But another point is, people want to bring up the thief on the cross. So it matters when his kingdom goes into effect. And he claims that his kingdom is not of this world. It's going to be delivered on the day of Pentecost. There's a certain dividing line you have to make and understand where does the kingdom start, and where does Christ begin to reign. And he doesn't reign until he's ascended and put on the throne. I think that's the important thing you take out of this. And of course, Pilate finds, agreement with his answer that he's not against Rome. And you're going to see a shift, here in just the next couple of verses, where he kind of changes his tune out of fear. But I think it's an important thing when we're talking about his kingdom. When does the kingdom start? Well, it's when the king is set on the throne and he's anointed.
Yeah. That's a good point. Tom.
Yeah, and Caleb kind of covered this. My only point is the conversation that Jesus has, Pilate gets his point. Yeah, I mean, Pilate understands that Jesus is saying, I'm not trying to raise an army to rebel against Rome, period. And that's why he goes out. And two interesting statements in verse 38, which I guess we're going to get to here right now, the what is truth. And then, I find no fault in him. He's not a threat to Rome.
Brian, real quick, you have that verse in Jeremiah you're talking about?
Yeah, I got it. Tom kind of linked me over to it, so I threw it up in our chat areas. Jeremiah 22:30 was where God had said that the descendant of Coniah, who was Jesus's ancestor, who was one of the last of the kings, write this man down as childless, a man who shall not prosper in his days. None of his descendants shall prosper, sitting on the throne of David and ruling in Judah. What's the promise here? That they're never again going to sit on that throne in Judah. That's not going to happen. So Jesus can't reign in Judah, Jerusalem, in that case. Now, and Caleb said it, Jesus can reign in heaven, and that's the only way he can reign. And of course, it's also over the whole earth, so that makes sense too. He says, "All authority is given to me in heaven and on earth." He makes the point. Where are you going to reign from? Which is superior, heaven or earth? I mean, this is common sense. Our premillennial friends a lot of times aren't even using common sense to think about this, but it is common sense. If you're going to reign from heaven. You're going to sit at the right hand of God. That's the true authority of reigning. So.
Yeah, and by the way, if you want that clarified a little more, read the book of Hebrews, because that's the point. That's the point the writer's making in the book of Hebrews. That's exactly what he's driving home. So anyway, so all of that ties in.
All right, let's see. The last two things to note here is Jesus makes the statement where he says, "Everyone who is of the truth hears my voice." Now, that's a whole discussion kind of in and of itself, kind of what that means and the number of times we've seen that, and we can discuss it briefly if you want to. But when Pilate hears that, he then says, "What is truth?" And when he had said this, he went out again to the Jews and said, "I find no fault in him at all." Any thoughts?
Oh, I find that very interesting. Pilate opens the philosophical discussion.
Yeah.
In making that statement here. I mean, obviously, if you study apologetics, evidence making the case for the cause of Jesus, for the cause of God, gospel, and so on, the resurrection, it is a philosophical discussion. I mean, yes, we have the facts and we're tying the facts together, but it's philosophical. And it basically starts with this question here: what is truth? I mean, before you can engage in the discussion about there is a God, Jesus is the Son of God, the Bible is the Word of God, you've got to answer the question, what is truth? And of course, we hear today about there are no absolute truths. And that's people that are rejecting the gospel. And of course, the answer, or what is the answer to somebody who says there are no absolute truths? You ask the question, is that an absolutely true statement? And I mean, it's a self-contradicting statement from a philosophical standpoint. And so Pilate understands all that. He understands the philosophy. He hears what Jesus says, but he's still not impressed to the point where he's convicted by Jesus. He says, it's basically you believe what you want to believe and I'll believe what I want to believe, but I don't think you're rebelling against Rome. And so he walks out and says he's not guilty.
Yeah. Okay. Well, let's go ahead real quick. And Brian, since you read a while ago, and I probably stopped you 2 verses short, let's come back to you. And if Tom's not offended by this, I'll have you to read 2 more verses. And then if we have time, we'll let Tom read the next batch.
Yeah, that's what
hold on one second.
Uh-oh, he does object.
No. Before Brian reads this, it's what it is. Let's see. It's in Matthew's gospel that you read about him being sent to Herod. And the only thing that I'm mentioning here is that takes place in between the 2 verses that Brian is about to read. We talked about the Caiaphas and so on. So you have in Matthew's account that when Pilate hears that he's from Galilee, he passes them off. And more than likely it's after what we just talked about here that he sends them to Herod, and of course they become great friends because of that and all those types of things. And then we come to this, you have the custom. So that's the only reason I wanted to mention that.
So what you're
Luke
saying,
23?
Tom, is they put,
Luke.
Yeah.
Yeah, you're right. It's Luke. I apologize. Yeah. It's Luke that talks about Herod. Luke chapter 23, verses 8 through 12. So that's where it's
so you're
at.
saying they
And
put
it's
the
only-
chapter break a couple verses off. They should have put the chapter break a couple of verses before.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay.
One more quick note on verse 36 before we move on is Jesus makes a point that if his kingdom was of this world, there would be fighting and people would not allow him to be handed over to the Jews. Well, that goes with the fact that Jesus is the Prince of Peace. And how are you going to take a kingdom and rule over all the world and yet be called the Prince of Peace in Isaiah 9:6? There's only one way to do that. And that's because it's a spiritual kingdom.
Yeah.
So I thought that was something we could bring up and look at that for a second.
Any thoughts on that?
That's a neat point. I hadn't really thought about it like that. That's a pretty neat point.
Yeah, great point. Yeah.
Yeah.
I always think of
That's all we
Muhammad.
gotta say about it. No.
Muhammad set up his empire by killing everybody he came to. Every city he conquered, by the sword. So it is very striking how that is.
Well, let's kind of build on that for just a moment. Let me get y'all into the gallery view here real quick. Even during the days of the Israelites, all the conquests were very physical in nature, slaughtering and everything. And that was the reason why one of the reasons why David wasn't allowed to build the temple, because he was a man of war, and he had shed much blood to expand the borders of the kingdom there. And where Solomon was then allowed to do that. But Jesus, that's a good point, what you said there. Yeah. Any other thoughts? Okay. All right, Mr. Brian, let's go ahead and bring in 39 and 40 of John chapter 18.
Yeah, so here we are, 39. But you have a custom that I should release someone to you at the Passover. Do you therefore want me to release to you the King of the Jews? And they all cried again, saying, not this man, but Barabbas. Now, Barabbas was a robber.
And I think the Luke text gives us a little bit more
Right.
background on it.
What's really interesting, so this is actually one of my favorite things to talk about when you talk about the events surrounding Jesus's trials, is the circumstances of Barabbas. We already noticed that there's a lot of things, each account, there's so much going on that they abbreviate each account. So we just mentioned that one whole trial is not even mentioned here in John. And of the all four accounts drop some of the trials because there's just too much going on. But every one of these accounts mentions Barabbas by name. They all four mention Barabbas by name, and they use words like notorious. I don't know if they say infamous, but robber, killer, insurrectionist, criminal of criminals. And there's about 3 points I'd like to make about Barabbas that I think are significant. And again, it should key us all in to say, hey, if they're all running out of space to get this story together, but they all think Barabbas is worth mentioning, why? Why is that? Well, first of all, Barabbas is kind of a testimony to the idea of Pilate trying to get Jesus off the hook. So in other words, let's say, who's the most notorious criminal we know? Well, I don't know if Caleb would agree. Maybe the three of us might say somebody like Charles Manson. He's gone now, but a really notorious criminal. And you say, okay, here's what I'm going to do. I'm going to give you guys a choice. You can either pick this guy that, as far as we can tell, never even did anything, or you can have Charles Manson released back on the streets to you. It's what we call a no-brainer, right? You're giving a choice that shouldn't even be a choice. Which one do you want free? Which one do you want on your streets tonight? And you would think, oh, this is easy. Anybody's going to pick, And so first and foremost, this is almost certainly Pilate trying to get Jesus set free by giving them a choice that's really not much of a choice. So it's insane that they're able to convince people that Barabbas is better off free than Jesus of Nazareth is. That's outrageous that happens like that. It really is a remarkable event that it's going to occur like that. Number two, Barabbas is really the moment where crucifixion comes up. Now, we never know this for sure, but it's kind of a good guess. Maybe it's not a necessary inference, but it's an inference that there are three robbers that are going to die that day. Now, we know there are two that are going to die with Jesus, but maybe there are three that day. Maybe Barabbas is going to die on a cross. So maybe that's the reason why when Barabbas comes up, the switch is crucify him. And it's interesting because it's the people that start yelling, crucify him. It's kind of the mob that goes this way. And since the mob is the one that wants Barabbas free, that might connect the two. That might be the connection of where crucifixion is brought in by the people because they're, hey, well, we were going to crucify Barabbas, so let's just crucify Jesus. it's hard to understand why that shift occurs right here, but it does seem to occur. All 4 accounts record that it occurs right here. This is where that shift happens. Now, third thing is, why is Barabbas important? All 4 mention the name Barabbas. You don't have to be much of a Hebrew or Aramaic scholar to figure out what the name Bar Abba means. Probably every one of us say, oh yeah, well, Bar means son of, and Abba means the father. So think of the story like this. Here's a guy that is completely guilty of a crime, but because Jesus is going to die, he gets set free. He gets released. No guilt, no, you got to serve, 40 days community service. They go in and unlock the door and he goes home. He is 100% set free. Jesus doesn't die as a robber or an insurrectionist, and by the way, this is kind of a big idea because sometimes people are kind of confused how Jesus takes on the sins of the world. He doesn't actually take the guilt of the sin. Jesus doesn't take the guilt of Barabbas. He takes the place of Barabbas. He takes the death that should have belonged to Barabbas, and he makes it his own death. And when Barabbas is set free, well, when you and I are set free, how many times in the New Testament are we told we become children of the Father? We become Bar Abba, the sons of the Father. So the idea is, here is this account of somebody who is really our story. This is us. I mean, we're Barabbas. We're the ones being set free by this death of Jesus on the cross, by the innocent person, and it should resonate that way. And I think that's why all 4 accounts want us to see this guy and to even know his name. I mean, his name is incredible, that it kind of ties us to us. It really is a remarkable story. And like I said, I wish we had more time. I'd love to talk even more about it because I just think it's so interesting how all 4 just kind of pass over this guy real quickly. And we don't know what happens to him next. Never again. I mean, there's an Anthony Quinn movie, I think, back in the 60s about him. But beyond that, we don't know what's going to happen to him. He's going to have to choose, because guess what? If he goes out and commits a crime again, he goes back. Jesus can't be crucified a second time for him. Kind of the Hebrews 6 statement of, if you go into sin, there's no second, Jesus can't die a second time for you. He goes back to the crime, but if he abides in this righteousness of being set free, he can maintain it. It's us. This is our story. And again, if somebody's like confused about how Jesus, is a sacrifice for sin, Barabbas is his story. Barabbas explains it.
In that movie, didn't they portray Barabbas as claiming to be a Christ? Claiming to be the Messiah, or am I thinking of another one?
I don't remember the movie very well. So
the only thing I remember is he's going around searching for why he was released for this man named Christ and trying to investigate who Christ was.
Okay.
But that's been many years ago that I saw that. Yeah. The thing I was thinking of that Brian brought up was they all mention him, so he must be pretty notorious, a criminal. And it goes back to what happens in Acts 26:26. When Paul goes before Festus, he says, these things weren't done in a corner. You guys all know all these things happened. So it just goes to show you that people know who Barabbas is. I think pretty clearly that everybody's going to bring it up. So, like, remember that guy Barabbas? That might still be around then when they're writing all the letters to us. Like, yeah, that guy is the one that gets released for Christ. I think that's pretty interesting to consider. All these people are going to remember him.
Okay. All right, good point. Any other thoughts about it? So if he had a son and gave him the same name, would he be Barabbas Abbas? Or Barabbas Jr.? Or
Barabbas?
Yeah, it would be Barabbas.
Oh, should have thought of that. Anything else important? My comment wasn't too important. I like that explanation, Brian. I really appreciate what you shared with that.
Right, yeah. And just bear in mind, based on what Brian was saying there, he talked about how notorious this guy was. He was guilty of the things that they're accusing Jesus of.
Yeah.
He was convicted of insurrection and murder. That's their charge. And like I said, I think that was interesting that Brian did bring up. Very likely the cross that Jesus was crucified on was intended for Barabbas.
Yeah, I never thought about that before. That's an interesting point.
Almost like Jesus' death sentence, as far as planning on the part of the Roman government or even the Jews, wasn't really, I mean, what really planned out? I mean, Jesus
Well, that there
knew
was
it
a
would.
cross ready to go.
Yeah.
You know, like I said, we
Yeah.
might not think that matters much, but you know, well, they probably had crosses ready to go all the time. Not necessarily.
Yeah.
It seems like I said, this is kind of and again, I'm basing a lot of this on the fact that they don't even talk about crucifixion, but all four accounts are clear that the moment they bring up Barabbas, that's as soon as that conversation happens is when they start saying, well, let's crucify Jesus. Where did that come from? I mean, the Jews didn't ask them, Pilate, to crucify Jesus.
Yeah, that's a good point.
Well, it's interesting the shift that we see, and you don't really understand it from John's perspective, I guess, unless you bring in the Synoptic Gospels, like Tom was saying, because you have that other trial, in the middle. But Pilate kind of makes a shift here. Like he's innocent, and then all of a sudden he's offering, Barabbas. We're going to try to scourge him. Like what? Pilate's, kind of reeling at this point, trying to please the people, but also be justified in the fact that Jesus is innocent.
Yeah.
Yeah.
He doesn't want to put an innocent man to death. So it's interesting the shift you see so quickly on Pilate's part.
Oh yeah, absolutely. And of course you at the idea of Barabbas, that would be one of the 7 times that he's declaring the innocence of Jesus, by giving the comparison and so on. And of course, when we get to the next stage, which I guess is next week, we see Pilate is weak. I mean, you see a weakness associated with that. Matthew mentions the washing of the hands and all those types of things. And so, I mean, but he knows he's not worthy of what's about to happen. He doesn't deserve it. And by the way, another one is the offering to scourge him. We're going to punish him. You know what? He's guilty. Let me punish him, and then let him go. He'll learn his lesson.
Yeah, look at the blood. I mean, isn't that enough? I mean, look what I did to this guy. I've humiliated him. I've beat him. I mean, really, we're done, right? I mean, that's exactly right, Tom. I think that's exactly why he's doing that. Yeah. I will say one big idea that we kind of covered briefly earlier is that why, Tom says, rightly so, Pilate is weak. Pilate is weak. Pilate just heard the great confession. That's 1 Timothy 6 says that the great confession was witnessed in front of Pilate. And Pilate says, what is truth? And Jesus has been talking about truth. I am truth. My word is truth. The John 17:11, truth has been the big thing, but Pilate doesn't know what truth is. I mean, and that's Pilate's problem. That's why he's not strong. That's why he's caught in the middle of something he doesn't understand, because he doesn't understand truth. And he says it. What is truth? I don't know what truth is. It's
Right, yeah. And also you understand, history tells us that Pilate was not exactly a paragon of virtue. He had some problems from a virtue standpoint, even as a ruler. If I understand correctly, he got in trouble. Yeah. Maybe even stayed in trouble.
Yeah, there are two parallel accounts as to what happened to Pilate after this. One is that he got in a lot of trouble and ended up, I think, taking his own life. But second, that he became a believer. And I hope the second one's true, but it's hard to say. I don't think we can know for sure which one is the accurate storyline. But I always like to say, whatever it was, after meeting Jesus, his life was changed dramatically. After this engagement with Jesus, it was never the same for him again.
Well, didn't his
Well, I
wife
think
say
he
she
had
had
that-
troubled nights because of this man?
Yeah.
She'd had a dream. She'd suffered many things in a dream because of this righteous man, or righteous or just. I can't remember. But
Yeah, and that's another one of the 7.
Go ahead, Caleb. Sorry.
I was gonna say, he has more fear for Caesar than he does for God, and it just goes to say you have to have fear for God, not man. And of course, Pilate had a lot of problems. He was accused of excessive cruelty before. I think when we study the intertestamental period, you see how turbulent the position he's in. And all the leaders there are. With Rome, they're trying to please the Jews, keep them in line, but they really want, pleasure from Rome. They don't want to lose their position with them. And you see the people get changed out a lot. So Pilate's in a pretty tight position where he's got to play it very carefully or he's going to get removed. And that's what he's more worried about at the end of the day. And that's what the scribes and Pharisees are worried about with Jesus. Well, if we're not careful, he's gonna unseat us, and we're gonna be out of a job. And of course, that's what it all boils down to: is you're looking for earthly pleasure over God.
That's a neat point, Caleb.
Yeah, most certainly. The passage that Brian referenced just a moment ago, and he had shared with this earlier. Boy, I think it's almost time for our study to be done. As Paul writes in 1 Timothy 6, verse 13, I urge you in the sight of God who gives life to all things, and before Christ Jesus, who witnessed the good confession before Pontius Pilate. It's what, Brian, you were referencing just a second ago. Yeah. All right. There's so much more we could look at in regards to this, but we are at the top of the hour, so it'll be a good time to bring this study to a close. Any other thoughts or comments on this section? And would this be a good place to pick up next week? Let's see, I'm in the wrong one. We're in John chapter 18. Where do we leave?
John 19:1.
Okay, it is 19:1, isn't it?
In John 19.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay. All right. Well, let's plan to start there next week. Be a good starting point. And, again, there's so much more that we could say about this. But the thing to take away is that he did this for us. I like what Brian said a while ago and kind of putting us in the place of Barabbas. He died upon the cross of Calvary so that we can be saved and not have to die in eternal condemnation, separated from the Heavenly Father. And it would have been interesting to know how this affected Barabbas' life. Did he change? Like what you're talking about with Pilate. Did these events change their lives? Paul, the events changed his life. With Pilate and Barabbas, there's no way of knowing whatsoever. But we would hope that maybe it did. And maybe it changes your life as well. We talk about factoring the truth into our lives, but we do this also in hopes that maybe you may find it beneficial too. If you have any thoughts or comments that you'd like to share with us when we're not in the live study, you can send those to us at questions@truthfactorlive.com or email us individually if you would like. And we'd be more than happy to hear from you. And if it's a question or maybe a comment that we could bring into our next study, then of course we will try to do that. I apologize to the chat room and the comment area. I've not looked down a whole lot. We got kind of started a little bit late, so my fault, and so kind of hit the ground running, and I forgot to really greet everyone who is with us. So thank you for joining us today. All right, fellas, any thoughts? All righty. Well, let's plan then to continue our study next Thursday. We can pick up here in John chapter 19, starting in verse 1. All righty. Thank you very much, and we'll see everyone next Thursday, Lord willing. Y'all have a wonderful week.